Thank you. Well, no, Amber and I, Amber's just, our little guy missed his nap today, and he was a bear. So she's put him to bed. But no, we so appreciate Lucas and Lisa and their friendship, and they were literally the first people in British Columbia that made us feel very welcome. Actually, just so you know, everyone else, we kind of walked away from that concert. Man, people here are snobs, except for those two. They were great. No, I'm just kidding. It wasn't all bad, but they were by far the most welcoming people, and honestly, really helped us to find our footing in British Columbia. So, so just before we get started, just a little bit of background. So I'm right now I'm pastoring in a church in Nanaimo, British Columbia, and so not too far from here, but this is my first time to Powell River, and I gotta say, like, it lives up to the hype. You guys got a good thing going on here. So it's great to be here. So after 17 years, I noticed that I'd lived through about 3 major cultural shifts in youth ministry, because about every 5 years we kind of see some of these shifts. And what I'm really excited to be able to do is actually just come alongside you, because I kind of figure that if you're going to come out on a Thursday night late when you could be at home catching up on your rest and your sleep, that you really want to be here. And so I want to make sure we give you as much content as we can. And so this is tonight. I would say this. I'll just warn you in advance. Tonight is going to be really depressing, and then like tomorrow will be like really, really inspiring. And what I mean by that is just that one of the reasons we struggle, I think, sometimes to get through what we need to do and how we can respond well to changes in culture and to trends is we are often wanting to jump into the first solution that seems reasonable without really necessarily understanding the depths of the problem. And so what I really want to do tonight is that I'm hoping you will walk out of here feeling like, I actually get this. Like, I see where this has been. And so just to kind of get started, this big question about how has the digital revolution changed the way our kids and preteens think and act? That's kind of what brings us here today, because it doesn't matter what your connection is. So some of you would have grandkids. Actually, just maybe, can we just, by show of hands, how many of you have grandkids? How many of you have grandkids with a smartphone? There we go. Okay, good. So there's that. Does anyone have any teenagers in the house right now, like your own children, or someone else's kids that just won't leave? That's okay too, because that's a whole nother side of it, right? So you've got teenagers in the house, and then the really interesting thing is, does anyone have any kids under the age of 10 at home? Okay. That's a big deal, because these are we're going to look at some trends that are not just significant, but these are trends that are actually becoming more significant over time. So one of the things that kind of prompted Lisa and I to begin to have this conversation is recognizing that we are always brushing up against these crisis moments in culture. Like, you can't really watch the news, or you can't have a conversation with someone if you're friends with a therapist, a school counselor, a member of the RCMP. You are just going to be constantly brushing up against these crisis moments when it comes to young people, because whether it's we had a suicide attempt, whether it's, there were some really, really nasty things going on online. The police have been called, like, you kind of get into those things. You might be brushing up against it in terms of, why is my 15-year-old so upset and they're not talking to me? And then it finally cracks out, well, so-and-so has been bullying me and this is what they're saying. Like, so we just kind of keep brushing up against these things. And we're very aware of the crisis, but I'm not sure that we always have a great understanding as to where we've gotten here. Generally, the place we want to start having the conversation is that we begin the conversation usually by saying, well, it's those dang smartphones. It's it's technology, and this is a thing. But I would say that's probably about a third of the problem. And so you've got a handout. I think most of you came in, you got a handout. And what we want to do is we want to look at these three things right here, and kind of how they contribute. So what we're going to do is kind of put the big picture together. So the first one is we need to how we got to the current crisis is it starts off with normal adolescent development. So that's our purple circle. And when we say that, we're talking about body-mind relationships, that there is just a developmental period of time where everything is changing. Our kids are going from being kids to adults, and they're somewhere in between those two goalposts. They're not kids anymore. They're not adults yet. So a lot of change is going on. So that's just, that's normal. That should be happening. And if we were just dealing with that, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. We would instead, you know what, we'd be sitting down for coffee, and I'd be saying, listen, by the time she's 21, she'll be a delight. Don't worry, and we would just, we can encourage each other, but there is this normal developmental process, this thing that's just happening. But if we need to look at some of the hallmarks of that developmental process to understand why the next two things become absolutely massive in their impact. So the second sphere we're going to look at today is really the world our teens live in. So we'd say, society and culture, it's their world. And so we say their world, we're talking about things like values, we're talking about what's important, we're talking about just, it's the environment that they're in and what it looks like. And in a lot of ways, we're looking at how it's structured. So we're taking adolescent development and we're kind of putting into this world. But here's the other thing that's changed so much I want to say in the last 20 years, but in the last 10 years, in the last 2 years, because it keeps changing, is the way that we interact with each other, the way we interact with everybody in our society is in an incredibly high-speed evolution consistently. So because technology is shifting and because the way we connect is different, then it's not just that the environment matters a lot, but it's the way we interact with our environment is changing radically. And so it's when we put these three things together, what you're going to see is like, this is kind of how we brush up against crisis on a regular basis. So here's my assumptions kind of going into a conversation like this, is that you're here because there's a young person in your life in some capacity that you are either trying to figure out how to help them to not wind up in a crisis, or you're trying to figure out how to support them on their way out of one. And that's going to be home base, because I think that's why we come to these things. We're sitting there. It's either I care about somebody, and we want to steer them away from the breaking point, or I really care about somebody, and they're there. Something's going on. Coming from that standpoint, I think our ability is to get our head around the big picture. What it does as adults is it gives us the opportunity to move from reacting to responding. And that's a lot of what we'll talk about tomorrow, is what our strategies are. But we can't respond intelligently when we're just sort of reacting to what we see on the surface. And so what we're going to get into right now is just kind of, hey, let's go beneath the surface and understand what's happening. So with that being said, I like interactive processes, but I'm also, like, my day job is a pastor, so I literally get paid by the word. So what that means is that if you don't ask questions, I guarantee you I can fill the space. I promise you I can do that. That's how it works. But what I would really, really not want to ever have happen is for you to walk out of here with a question unanswered, for you to walk out of here saying, well, we talked for 30 seconds on this one thing that was so important to me, but 7 minutes on this other thing that's just not really, So with that being said, at the end of, I'll kind of present some things to you. And in between the dots, if you have any questions, you have comments like, hey, but what about this? We'll just make sure we take a couple of minutes there, because this is your time. And I like I said, I could fill it, but I want to fill it with things that are useful to you. So do you agree? Is this okay? Yeah, you're good? Awesome. Good. Well, there's lots of coffee, so we can do this. So here we go. Let's just start off with adolescence, everybody's favorite time, because you're all here and you all did it. And hey, wasn't puberty the best time of your life? So great. So glad that we got to do that. We have a joke in our program where all of my adult youth workers, I always just say to them, be like, listen. Once they're on our team, I say, I want you to find a picture of yourself when you were in grade 7, and I want you to show me. And there was like, no, nobody loves their grade 7 photo. That is the year. Some of you were cool by grade 8, like you were early bloomers. Like by grade 8, you were cool. Others of you, it didn't happen until you were like 30, but that's okay. And so, but grade 7 was like the school picture year that I found out universally everybody hated. They're like, I don't know why I thought I looked good in that style, but I did. My mom tried to tell me, don't go to school and get your photo taken with that haircut, but I'm going to do it anyways, because what do you know, Mom? Okay, so this is the thing, adolescence, right? It's this really interesting time for all of us. And it's just this normal thing that should be happening. The key concept, we could say a billion things about adolescence, but the big word that we want to hit is a psychology word, which is individuation. Now, if any of you went to, psych school, or if they have that, I don't know if that's even a thing, but anyways, if you had to sit through any kind of a developmental psychology class, this word comes up. It's a big word. And so what individuation means, in a nutshell, simplified, is individuation is the process of determining who you are when you are not under the direct care and influence of those who raised you, of your family of origin, of your mom and dad, basically. So when we go through a process of individuating, it kind of goes from, well, when you're 5, who you are and your identity that's expressed is very attached to mom, because mom bought your clothes from the store, and mom dressed you, and mom's the one who introduced you to Thomas the Train one day when you were like, I cannot possibly get housework done because you're into everything. So, she put it like, hey, watch this. You're like, wow, Thomas the Train's great. And so but mom and dad are really influential in terms of your whole concept of identity. And all of a sudden, starting around age 11 and really kind of hitting its peak at around age 14, you've just got this process where, and it's very natural, where every single healthy human being needs to say, when I am not under mom and dad's roof, when I'm not with mom, who am I then? And this creates a very tiny, small amount of tension in homes. Just a little bit, like the smallest amount, but it's just a little. Because all of a sudden, you'll have these conversations. If, as a parent, if you're like, this is really, really important and good and cool, your kid's like, and for all of those reasons, I think it sucks because you think it's awesome. And is this rebellious? It's actually not. It's really just this process of saying, if I agree with you, it means that I'm not individuating because you're still forming my identity. So I just have to figure this out. And so you kind of get into that. So it's a little bit of tension. And really what it is individuating takes the 3 central... Listen, this is true of every adult. These are the 3 things that every single human is trying to figure out. Who am I? Where do I belong? And what is my purpose? But when you're 11 and into 12, it's the first time you're aware of those questions. Because there's not a lot of 8-year-olds who are walking around just being like, who am I really? Like on an existential level, I just am trying to figure out, that's just not, 8-year-olds are more thinking, being like, for my next birthday party, we're going to the trampoline park. That is it when you're 8. It's not, I was really contemplating what Nietzsche said about the nature of human, no, that's not 8-year-olds. But all of a sudden, 11, 12, this thing comes up actually, who am I? What kind of person do I want to be for me? And then the next big question is, and where do I belong? Well, when you're a kid, when you're 8, it's where do you belong? With my mom. That's where you belong in your family. All of a sudden, 11, 12, 13, it's in the wider world, where do I belong? This is the family I've gotten. Who will be the family I choose? That becomes a big question, right? And so the primacy of friendship relationships, peer relationships kind of takes off. And then lastly, what's my purpose? Which to a 13-year-old really just looks like, what am I good at? So if you've ever noticed that, your 13-year-old, used to really like math and oh, I hate math, math sucks, I'm not a math person, these big shifts in interest and whatever, is because purpose is simply defined by what I'm good at. And if I'm not good at something literally this week, well, it's not my purpose, it's just not who I am. I'm just going to wipe it, and this becomes part of it. It's the reason why if they are good at something, it becomes their life, right? I'll live for soccer, or whatever it is that they do. And so this is just a natural, healthy, normal, good thing. But this is why we see during adolescence that boundaries are being pushed. Because they have to be pushed, because that's how you figure out who you are. And here's the interesting thing is, so what we also see in this time period is you're going to see that this is where we see the assertion of power and the testing of relationships. Because part of trying to figure out who you are and who your people are and what your purpose is figuring out how far you can push relationships before they break. And it's also figuring out how powerful are you? What are your real limitations? So I'm going to steal a little bit from the next 2 circles, but I would like to give you an illustration. It might help you just connect some of these dots. So if you're trying to figure out if you're powerful, if you're asserting power, let's just look at the differences typically, and this wouldn't be universal because we can't just neatly define everything into a male and female gender package, but just for simplicity, would say generally males would behave this way, generally we see females behave this way as far as the research goes. So generally speaking, we see that most of our males tend to try to figure out how powerful they are through direct competition in a physical environment. So there's a reason why your 14-year-old who plays hockey can't wait to like put his elbow through someone's face, right? Because it's just kind of like, because it's just like, yeah, took that guy down, okay, I'm strong. And then when it happens to him, he's like, not that strong, steer clear of that guy. Like, and it becomes this thing where, a great example would be, school wrestling, right? Where, there's a draw to this for a lot of males simply because it's a way to establish the boundaries. It's like, how strong am I? Like, can I do this? And so they will pick the avenue that gives them the best advantage. So if they're just a brute and you feed them steroids, they're going to wrestle. Okay, that's just going to be who they are. But you know what? If maybe they're a little small for their age or whatever, but where do they find themselves? Well, I'm going to pick a sport that's going to be more about technique than it is about sheer size, or that's the kind of hockey player I'm going to be, right? It's going to be about this, but I want to see where I'm strong. And it becomes very much about physical competition. When that happens, when you get a clear idea of, okay, this is how strong I am, this is what I can do. But generally what happens is someone blows the whistle and the game ends and everybody goes home. And so it's that weird phenomenon. And guys, you know what I'm talking about. It can be like literally, 20 minutes ago, I was grinding this guy's head into the ice, and then it's like, hey, good game, bros. Like all of a sudden the shift, right? Because someone blew the whistle and it ended, and it's like, okay, this is good. We know that period of time has come to an end. With our girls, though, is they don't tend to, we see, again, the research would suggest that we're not seeing them necessarily gravitate to physical competition as a way to determine whether they're powerful or not. It tends to be more social. So with girls, you get this thing where all of a sudden it's like, has everyone here seen the movie Mean Girls? If you haven't, you need to watch it on Netflix like this weekend, because this is going to help you understand female power dynamics through adolescence probably better than anything. But this is the thing. So you get this thing where it's, how far can I push this relationship? How can I assert dominance over this person and thus be powerful and feel powerful and know what my strengths are? So when this happens with girls, here's the big problem. And we'll get into this with the technology, but nobody ever blows the whistle and says, all right, game's over. See you next week for a rematch. Oh, you're going down. Like, that doesn't happen. And what used to would have happened is, let's just say there's a certain power dynamic at school, but maybe there's a different power dynamic on the gymnastics team. And maybe there's still another different power dynamic at church. And then you kind of go home to your family, and it's not a peer set of relationships, so it's kind of like the castle where none of these power dynamics are at play. All of a sudden you bring in technology where students are connected all the time. So the power dynamics at school follow me to gymnastics. The power dynamics at gymnastics overlay school and church. And whatever's going on in all these places. And by the way, when I go home, the messages are still rolling in, the posts are still being put up, and therefore no one ever blows the whistle. So what we're actually going to see is, we'll look at the differences between how males and females are both struggling. But where our girls tend to struggle is sleep deprivation and heightened anxiety, simply based on the fact that, imagine if the wrestling match never ended. Imagine if your boy's walking down the hallway to math class, if at any given moment it was perfectly legal for some guy in his wrestling leotard to just come flying out of a classroom and just like, bam, slam you to the ground from the back. Ha, got you. And then the wrestling just continues right there and then. And, you've no sooner got up for that, but you walk into the classroom, and somebody comes and puts you in a chokehold from behind. Like, just imagine if no one ever blows the whistle. What would that do to your nerves? Okay, but that's what we see happening with our girls, right? So again, part of this just comes down to is that this need to push boundaries and assert power is actually pretty natural, but it can be taken in a really unhealthy way. And so we're going to look at, again, some of those trends and how they overlap. Yeah, so anyways, any questions about that so far? We got you still? Yeah? Okay. Awesome. Then let's look at this. So here's just about this, a feedback cycle. So This is what identity formation looks like. Okay, this is how it works. So how it works is you do something, and we will call that performance, which is a really weird way of saying it, but we'll say, you do something. So it's performance, and it could be anything. So we'll take our 15-year-old girl as an example. So our 15-year-old girl, she, her performance is, she likes singing, she's singing in a choir. That's her performance, right? And then after she performs, there's an interpretation by the audience, right? The people are there, they listen, we listened to you sing, we thought you sounded really good, or we thought you didn't, or whatever it is. Which then turned that interpretation then sponsors an adjustment. So if the feedback she gets is, man, on that first song, you just looked like you were so into it. You were smiling. I felt like you were like the best. That second song though, like you seemed like you were stumbling over your parts, and you probably weren't. It just was that you really weren't smiling. I wasn't smiling. I looked back, okay. And then all of a sudden there's this adjustment based on the feedback, right? Because the performance has been interpreted, which then goes to mean the next time there's a performance, now we see this pasted on smile the whole time because I wanna respond to the feedback. That's easy in a choir setting, but now what happens in terms of identity formation on a character level? Well, say your 15-year-old behaves a certain way at home. She tells a lie, she gets caught. That behavior is interpreted by mom and dad, and there is feedback. And based on the nature of the feedback, there will be an adjustment. Now, interestingly enough, the adjustment could be to say, I want to conform to those expectations to get better feedback, or I don't believe I'm ever going to get better feedback, so watch how much I can make you mad, right? But there will be an adjustment based on the feedback. So this makes sense how identity formation works all the time. Let's think about this in a second. In a healthy world, identity formation happens because the way you live your life as a young teenager, as an early adolescent, 11 really to 16, your performance is interpreted by people who are deeply committed to you, by mom and dad, by grandma and grandpa, by aunts and uncles, by close family, people who have been there for the long haul. And so if that's the people you're surrounded with, and you're just doing life. When we say performance, we mean literally it could be anything you do, just the way you live. It's being constantly interpreted by these people. They're giving you feedback. It causes this adjustment because generally speaking, we want good feedback. We want people to like us. And so in a healthy world, that's how identity formation happens. But again, stealing a little bit of where we're going to go, what happens when the primary influencers are strangers and acquaintances on the internet? So what I mean by this is now this 15-year-old girl has her own YouTube channel, and we'll talk about why she might be doing that later, but she has her own YouTube channel. Hey guys, I started a channel, it's just me, it's just my thing, you just gotta watch me on YouTube. Hey, hit subscribe, this is all going on. And there's these comments, and the comments are, a lot of them are from strangers. Some of them might be from a few friends from school, but people she knows well. Statistically, her parents are not watching her YouTube channel, by the way. So there's all these strangers and peers who are looking at her performance and starting to give feedback. So let's just say, it's like, when one video is like, you suck, you're so lame, I hate you, whatever. It's like, and she's trying to be cool and hate who's gonna hate, whatever. But it's there. So she's thinking, how can I not get this negative feedback? Let's say someone posts on there, it's like, oh my gosh, you look so sexy, blah, 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 because I whatever. All of a sudden, now there becomes this thing, well, I'm going to make adjustments. So now the clothes I'm wearing are different, the way that I'm speaking is different, the kind of content I'm talking about is different. And this may be happening on my YouTube channel, but does this spill it into real life? Well, sure, because when I put myself on the internet and my video was seen by 934 people, and they all said I looked really sexy when I wore this like a deep plunging V, oh, cool. Well, that's cool. So now that I know that, this is now going to be part of my identity. This is who I am. This is how I dress. This is how I do things. So the people who are giving feedback to the performance are not necessarily mom and dad and grandpa, the people who are going to be there for you. It's strangers and acquaintances. But it's equally as powerful. Okay, so this is, when we think about adolescent development, it's about identity formation in a big way, but this is how identity formation always works. Now, if we are not in an unhealthy place, this tends to go just fine. But now we need to look at the world we actually live in. So if you want to go to the next slide here we go. So now let's look at, well, what's happening in our changing world? So all that adolescent development stuff has been happening since the beginning of time. It's just kind of been what it is. But our world changes quite a bit. And I just want to say that the idea that some of the struggles we see young people going through, I hear statements all the time, and they're like, well, yeah, like, my 17-year-old, like, let's just be honest, doesn't the science say that their prefrontal, lobe of their brain isn't fully developed? So, of course they can't make great decisions. This is just to be expected. Well, it's like, yeah, okay, but that doesn't actually really work well. Because historically speaking, like 60 years ago, we had like 17-year-olds jumping out of airplanes into Normandy to like liberate, you understand, like it's the same, if this was a biological thing only, we would actually see consistency over time. We don't actually see that. And what's interesting is when you look at second world developing nations, we look at their statistics, look at the research there, what we're actually seeing is that, in societies where it's still common for a 16-year-old male who only has a life expectancy of 40 to be married and have a job at age 16, he actually does it. Because that's what is required. And, that's just how it goes. So the idea of saying, well, what we're seeing is surely a biological thing, well, that just doesn't hold up from a research standpoint. And, Dr. Robert Epstein, who was the editor of Psychology Today for a number of years, taught psych at Harvard, he actually has challenged the credibility of the studies that say that we have delayed brain development through adolescence. And so it's simply, basically he's just said, sorry, but that research is not as conclusive as everyone wants it to be. Normally I don't listen to conspiracy theories, but I thought, he did teach psych at Harvard, and he was the general editor of Psychology Today, and he says that the study wasn't conclusive. Interesting, right? So is it just biological? I don't think so. I think what we see instead is we've actually crafted a culture, an environment that's highly toxic to young people. And here would be, if I could just give a way to look at this potentially. So in 2011, which is, I haven't seen any more recent statistics, so I apologize, but it's probably not getting better. So in 2011, we were able to say that 54% of North American teenagers were prescribed psychotropic drugs. Okay, so in 2011. So let's just think about that for a second. And 54% of North American teenagers have been prescribed psychotropic drugs, meaning an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication being the two most common. There are other ones. Now, if 54% of North American teenagers were all on chemotherapy because they had cancer, would we be declaring a national health emergency? We'd be saying, hold on, wait a second. And what would we be saying? Well, biologically, it's just a really stressful time for the body, so, it develops cancer. We wouldn't be saying that. What we'd be saying is, what's in our environment that's toxic that's causing this to happen? That's what we'd be saying. But we don't ask those questions. Now, why don't we ask those questions? Well, quite frankly, because, the economic engine of the Western world depends on us never asking those questions. So if we create a toxic environment for young people, but it is highly profitable, we're kind of willing to look the other way. And so where we land in is this. So we've got cultural shift, and let's just think about a 100-year span. And I know, by the way, I'm flying over a ton of content, but if you have questions, please ask, because this is a lot. 1919 to 2019, last 100 years. Big shifts that we would see in society is in 1919, Canada, the US, primarily an agricultural society. So most young people are growing up on the family farm, right? And because we don't have a Walmart superstore down the street, if we need a cup of sugar, if we need some, well, where do we? Well, we go to our friends next door, which is actually I'm going to get on that horse and take that down the dirt path for a couple minutes and hopefully come back with some sugar for mom, right? So you've kind of got this thing where there's this incredibly tight-knit community. They have no choice but to be. There's just no, the economy is not this, does not allow for individual living. You depend on your next door neighbor. And then on top of that, your family is so interdependent, and that's your primary social group too. I mean, your sibling, you come from a big family, and you're all tight because between farm chores and going to school and all the things that happen, that's your friends. Your sister's kind of your friend, your brother's kind of, because this is who you have. And then on top of that, the single, and this is not a push to say that, the reason it's all gone to crap is because, can I say that? I'm sorry, I did. Well, anyways, the reason it's all gone to crap is because it's in Powell River. You guys are totally laid back, so I can say crap. Yeah. I'll make, I can probably make weed jokes and you guys will be fine too. So, that never happens in Powell River. But anyways, I come from Nanaimo, okay? Believe me, I've seen some things. So here's the thing. It's not just, a lot of Christians want to say, well, the reason we're having this problem is because we used to be so Christian and now we're not. Okay, there's a theological discussion we have there, but forget that for a second. Forget the values of it. You had a basically homogenous society where everybody had the same set of values. So regardless of what denomination you were a part of, whether you were Catholic or Protestant or whatever, there were certain things that were just out of bounds. And so, because the thing is, your family would say, hey, as a matter of civic responsibility, we're all going to go to church on Sunday. And when we go there, someone is going to remind us that we're supposed to not lie. And by the way, help the poor people. Okay, that's this universal thing. So what happens is you see society shift, where now faith and community and family, they're really the centerpiece of society, right? It's a big shift. And so, we live in a society defined by money, sex, and power. It's the pursuit of economic success. Sexuality is presented as a commodity in our culture. And the story or the narrative that we get is that it is impossible to be fulfilled as a human being if you are not free to express your sexual desires openly and pursue them. And that's the story, right? So sex is a commodity. It's something that you chase after, and if you get it the way you want it, then you'll be happy. You couldn't possibly be happy if you don't. So the pursuit of sex, the pursuit of money, and essentially the pursuit of power. This is you see this in the political realm, but you're going to see it in power politics at work. Again, probably this never happens in Powell River because you guys are so cool and laid back, and your bosses probably are so chill because they smoke so much weed and everything. But I was just thinking, you ever maybe for other people who don't live in such a great place, you might see that at work they've got these weird power play dynamics going on where they've got a supervisor who literally has no good reason to make someone's life hell except to feel powerful. It would never happen here, but in other parts of Canada, this happens sometimes, right? And the challenge is those power politics. What is that about? Well, that's because that's a status thing. So our society looks really different than it used to. And in addition to that, one of the things that we see in the 100-year span is that we see our young people spending more and more hours exclusively with other young people. And so, when you think about just the shift over the last 100 years, the majority of time that 15-year-olds spend nationally, not looking at one community, nationally, the majority of time that teenagers spend together, or spend is with other 15-year-olds. So, if you want to look at the way that basic education model for North America is, let's take a bunch of 15-year-olds and put them with a bunch of other 15-year-olds for 6 hours a day, Monday to Friday. And by the way, times are tough, so mom and dad are both working, and so when they do get home, there's not going to be anyone there, so you're going to continue to talk to 15-year-olds on their phones, right? So you're just going to see, and then when they're not there, well, now we're going to hockey practice, and I'm going to hang out with some more 15-year-olds, and so the peer dynamic is huge, and then on top of that, we get into this issue of busyness. People are really, really busy in Western culture. So we do 10 times as much, 10 times as fast. So we've got a constant go, 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 which means you have less time to just kind of take a step back and chill out and figure things out. But a lot of the go, go, go for young people is spent with each other. Now here's the interesting thing that will shake your confidence to your core. Because of globalization, I can hear your thoughts now. Well, that's really, really scary. I'll have you know, we homeschool our kid, and we spend a lot of time with them one-on-one because, we're involved in their lives. It's great. We got some good connection that way. Globalization means that your kids do not need to be directly experiencing the environment to have the effect of the trend. So if the majority of teenagers in Canada live in a basically adult-free world, and that reality is reflected on every television show, movie, blog article, YouTube channel, the globalization of that trend, the fact that it's bigger, means that every interaction that your teen is having with the larger world says that even though they are not experiencing this, this is normal, and that therefore affects them. So this is what it is, right? Like, this is globalization in a nutshell. So, on top of that, there's one other little bit of really bad news here. So there's a really interesting book called Hurt, and then the sequel came out, Hurt 2.0. So Chap Clark embedded himself in a Southern California high school. He's originally a sociologist by training. And he said, I just want to study how young people interact. And they said, great, yeah, come. You can come and teach an English class or something. He had a PhD, so they were going to let him do whatever he wanted. And so he's doing this, and he's just studying young people. And his conclusion was, he said that every single young person that I in the entire school, their true self lives in what I would call the underworld. Meaning that there is this world that's adult-free, and that's where their true self comes out to play. And every time they interact with an adult, they are simply giving that adult the version of themselves that they feel is least likely to experience rejection. Because by and large, all of the young people in this high school are terrified of yet another rejection from an adult figure in their life. And this was the summary of, years of research. So the way this trend comes out is that what you have is you've got young people who every single relationship they have with an adult in this new world we've created is actually performance-based. Because if we see the pursuit of money, sex, and power as the primary things that get us up out of bed in the morning as a society, then what happens is that every relationship you have with a young person as an adult is performance-based. So my teacher wants better grades, my parents want me to stop getting in trouble and stop talking back, my coach wants me to run faster, my youth worker wants me to read my Bible more. And you just fill in the blank. Every single adult relationship is an adult who wants something from me. And when they realize that I can't necessarily do this, or I'm going to disappoint you, I will put on the face that best serves to shield my heart from feeling rejected. This gets compounded in a really interesting way by the way that, for example, we do sexual education in schools. And so I had a really interesting conversation with a teacher in 2010 or something like that, where we were just talking about the way they were talking about sexual ethics. And of course, as per usual, it's the general message of the class was, your sexual expression is something very personal, and when you feel like you're ready, you should be able to do what you want. And that was kind of the idea. Just, hey, use a condom. That was kind of the general sales pitch. And I remember just saying to this teacher, I said, you'll have to excuse me, I think that's blatantly irresponsible. And he was just a little taken aback. He's like, well, I know, because you're a youth pastor, you work at a church, you think. So I said, take the morality, this has nothing to do with morality. I said, I just think it's blatantly irresponsible. And he's like, push back a little bit about why. And I said, because the thing is that you've just given a bunch of 14-year-olds permission to follow their heart into something. You basically said, this is okay, we're kind of setting the standard, this is fine. So I said, if they don't use a condom well and she gets pregnant, or if that dude's heart is just devastated because the girl that he thought liked him didn't, and turned out now she's with his friend, and he wants to commit suicide, and she's pregnant, doesn't know what to do. I said, is it cool if they come over to your house and sit in your living room? Will you just kind of walk with them through this? He's like, well, you see, that's absurd. I'm a teacher, I could never do that. What are you saying? I'm like, okay, cool. Because just so you know, I will, because I'm a community youth worker, so that's my job, is to sit with kids when they go through this, number one. But number two, I said, the person who just gave them permission to do whatever the heck they wanted to is not there when the consequences of their actions actually catch up with them. So teenagers would never articulate that, but they experience that. And so what that means is that most of the state of our society right now is that young people are experiencing the systematic abandonment by the adult world. In other words, the adult world will say, here's the values, here's the way it is, you do whatever you want you do is fine. But if it goes wrong, if it goes sideways, the people who gave that message are not there to help me pick up the pieces. So what that really means is adults cannot be trusted. And it means that they're very scary. And the only people who know what I'm going through are a bunch of 15-year-olds, who I spend a lot of time with anyways. And I'm sure they'll tell me what I should do. And so this becomes the trend. The underworld trend was what we would call that. So that's a scary world. That's where we live. This is what what things look like. But there is another layer that actually then adds a little bit more scariness to it. Sorry, you're probably already like, well, I'm already scared, so thank you for that. Anyways, before we talk about now how technology because we haven't even talked about technology yet, okay? We've not talked about how that comes in, but most people, when they're dealing with, what do we do with this smartphone problem over here, they're not even thinking about identity formation and the feedback cycle. They are not thinking about, what we call horizontal mentoring, when a bunch of 15-year-olds all mentor each other. Like, they're not thinking about that. They're just thinking about technology. We have to actually put all the pieces together. So any questions before we keep moving on? Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, it's a great question. Globalization. So what we mean by globalization is because it would used to be that if something was really trendy in Hong Kong, it may never have an impact in New York City. And the reason is because, travel time being extensive, language barriers being extensive, there's just separate worlds. And so globalization is just this idea that, we no longer live in, you guys heard the phrase, the global village, right? This is because everybody's so connected. And part of that is technology, right? So because everything is interconnected, because we do have so much common language, you get these weird things where, a K-pop song that goes viral in Korea, there's not any English lyrics in it whatsoever, becomes a massive trend in Texas. Which you think, how does that even? But it just does. So globalization is this idea that we just aren't isolated from other trends. What happens in the next round of elections in the European Union will have a direct impact on every single one of your lives. Economically, socially, values, because we're just so interconnected. So globalization just takes away the individual spheres and it makes one big sphere. Does that make sense? Yeah. So so our only application of this would simply be to say, let's say you have a community that says, hey, we don't love an educational model that isolates teenagers from adults and puts them with only their peers for X number of hours a day. Let's do it really differently. Okay, that's great. That might be a really intelligent choice and say we're going to do it differently. However, if in the rest of the world, isolation of teenagers from adults is the norm, it means every song that's written, every movie that's produced, every television show that comes on the air will always be referencing as normal what's normal for the majority, not the minority, which means that they are actually still being influenced by the global trend regardless of what environment they're in. Yeah, does that make sense? It's kind of a weird, it's weird stuff, but it's just important that I think we understand that the changes we make on a micro level are significant, but they are not necessarily like a firewall of protection in any way. If that makes sense. Cool. Yeah, great. So then here's the third layer, and it only gets better. So then the way we interact in this world that's different is also evolving rapidly. And so we see the rise of technology, and we're going to talk about the media as the message in just a second. But here's the interesting, image is everything. So because technology allows us to curate our images. So what I mean by curate, imagine this. So it's let's just assume that everybody in the room has an Instagram account, even though statistically I could probably peg off who doesn't, but that's okay. So here's the thing. Just imagine for a second it was really important to you to post photograph of your face twice a day for everyone, right? Let's just say that would really matter to you, even if it doesn't. Well, you've got filters and all these types of things and ways to brush these photos up. But if you're going to do that, so, let's say you'd be like, hey, this is me. Now, I have decisions to make. I have decisions to make about what's in my background. I have decisions to make about what I'm wearing. I have decisions to make about, my face, and if I have blemishes or acne, did I Photoshop it out, and all these types of things. I have decisions to make about the expression on my face. I have decisions to make about the caption. And because what we're really doing is we're curating it, right? We're kind of saying, I'm going to take control of the message that other people receive about me. Now, that was not possible 100 years ago. Because 100 years ago, you look like what you look like, and you are where you are, and if you're not famous, you don't look like you're famous. I mean, the reality of a curated image means that what I can do, I could choose on my Instagram feed to only ever post photos of me with like sweeping West Coast landscapes around me. And it's like, think about it. I may actually spend only 15 minutes a day outside taking this photo, but spend the rest of my time in an office. But if I only ever post, boom, what do people believe in? Like, oh man, Ryan's so outdoorsy. He's such a great life. He's always out in nature. How does he find the time? It's just so great. Because I've curated that image for what I want it to be, because it's possible. So we live in a world where image is everything. And so it's the post-truth advertising. It's like, you ever look at ads from the 1940s? It's like 9 paragraphs on why you need to buy a Ford, 9 paragraphs. Like, well, for starters, let's just talk about the way that we do, it's just this whole thing. And at the very end, it's like this little logo. Like, that's just it. Like, it's a newspaper article. Right? You get into advertisements now. It's like one word with somebody in a bathing suit behind it. Like, seriously, that's all terrain. I don't know why they're in a bathing suit or whatever. It makes sense. Okay, great. I'm going to buy a Subaru now. Like that's just kind of the way things are going. So when we're in this thing where it's post-truth, it's not about actually telling you something that's truthful or factual. It's about trying to elicit a feeling in you, and we do that by curating images, and that's the way our world works. So Neil Postman wrote a really interesting book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which became creepy in the most recent U.S. election. Because one of the things Neil Postman said is, he said, in the future, politicians will not have to worry about whether they were lying or telling the truth. They will only have to worry about whether they look like a liar or they look like a truth teller. Now, he wrote that book in the 80s. So this is where we're going. All of this is possible with technology because if you have a smartphone in your pocket, you have a digital publishing platform where you can curate everything about who you are. When you send a text message, when you post something to social media, when you interact with something, you get to decide. And so because of that, it means that we live in a world where we can have a disingenuous reality. Now, what is the result of that? You can only connect with people as far as you are authentic. So people who love my curated image, the further that image is from my real life, is the further that person actually is from me. Now, if you're stuck in that cycle of identity formation, remember the feedback loop, do you think there might be a temptation for a 14-year-old to curate the best picture of themselves possible, even if it is not truthful? Yeah. So then what does that do? I've got 900 followers on Instagram and I've never felt more alone. That's what it does. Because it actually, curating an image creates a deeper sense of isolation. And of course, it's not limited to young people because adults do this all the time, but we curate an image and then we feel isolated. That's a big deal. Technology does tend to isolate us. The other thing is that we mostly in our culture see technology as amoral, meaning that we don't really think of technology in the lens of, is it right or is it wrong? We don't look at it that way at all. In fact, the way we look at technology in our culture is to say, well, technology is inevitable. It's not good and it's not bad. It's all what you do with it. That's an interesting perspective. I'm not sure that's actually true. And in fact, this is the debate as we deal with climate change now that people are asking. They're saying, was the internal combustion engine worth it? right? It's the classic line from the film Jurassic Park. We were so excited about that we could do a thing, we never stopped to ask if we should. And now this is actually what, with the most recent iOS update for Apple, they created this thing, this visual everyday thing. Here's how much screen time you had today, because they've recognized and said, we were so excited about creating this incredible piece of technology that could fit in your pocket that we never actually stopped to consider what would be the developmental effect of a 12-year-old having it. Oops. So this is the way technology changes things. We are always on, always available, with unlimited amount of information at our fingertips. That's the result. That's the digital revolution. So think about it this way, is that, 50 years ago, 25 years ago, if you were writing a paper for high school, you had to go to the library. I know. Let us put it this way. Why were certain universities earmarked as the best of the best? Why was a Harvard or an Oxford or a Cambridge or a Stanford or a McGill, why were these the best universities? You know why? Because they had the biggest libraries. Because in the previous era, what really marked an institution as worth its salt was how much information you could get there that you couldn't get anywhere else. So if I go to Harvard and I've got access to the Harvard library and the Harvard professors who have access to the Harvard library, I will learn more there than I'll learn at my community college. It only is a small library. Well, now the reality is that everything has shifted. The question is not who has the biggest library. The thing is, we all have the biggest library in our pockets, and our young people do as well. But the challenge is we have no idea what to do with all that information. So the whole nature of education shifts from giving away information to teaching you what to do with information. Right? So we would call that a Newtonian to quantum shift, but you don't need to know that. That's just for grad students that we pester with things. So anyways, let's go to the media as the message, and we're going to take we're about to take a little break just because you're going to need it, trust me. So here's how technology changed everything for your kids. This book came out in the 60s. Maybe you guys remember this book, Marshall McLuhan, The Medium is the Message. What do you notice about the cover, first of all? Somebody say it. Well, message is spelt wrong. This is actually the cover. They said the medium is the message, and then they mistyped and wrote the medium is the massage. And you know what? When they pointed out, Marshall McLuhan said, leave it. It just illustrates my point. His whole thesis was this: societies have been shaped more by the nature of the media by which men communicate than by the content of the communication. Meaning, when the printing press was invented, more influential than any one book that comes out of a printing press is the fact that there's a printing press that can make books on demand. Does this make sense? That changes the nature of society. Telephones. Before the invention, do you think that our society was shaped more by the most serious conversations on the telephone between world leaders, or by the fact that someone invented a telephone? Changes the entire way that we connect. So the medium itself changes society more than the content. So when people are worried about what's on your kids' phones, the fact that they have phones is actually far more influential. Because the content could change any second, but the fact that the medium is there, the fact that we have instantaneous communication. And so what's interesting is when microwaves were first invented, there were critics of them, and this is going back to the early microwave prototypes, 1950s, 60s, and so what happened is they would say, this is a disastrous technology, it will be the downfall of society, people will be so lazy when they can make food this quickly. This is literally, there were ethical concerns about microwaves. This is going to destroy society. And what did the proponents of microwaves say? No, it's going to save society. People are really, really busy. If they can cook their food fast, they'll have more time for their families. Well, we found more time for something, but it probably wasn't our families. Interesting, right? So the technology, so the thing is, when we think about technology, a couple of things you need to have in your head is, remember, at one point, forks were the cutting edge of technology. Think about that. In a world pre-fork, Yeah, you're like, what do you, like, well, I'm eating with my hands, and someone's like, I got this crazy idea. I'm going to put spikes on the end of a stick. It's going to change your life. And I guarantee you there was somebody in that society who says, no, this is terrible. All of our kids, they won't even know how to eat with their hands. What do they do if they don't have a fork? You're going to destroy us all. This is probably the debate going on. But technology becomes integrated into our lives, and it actually shapes the nature of how we do life. So taking the idea that technology does not matter, it doesn't really fly, because it's changing things. So the fact that students have, your teenage young people, they have in their pockets a device that has more computing power than the Apollo space shuttle did. By far, just so you know, exponentially more. And that they can communicate in real time anonymously with any person on the planet with whom they choose to do so. That changes the game. So this is what we see. You can go to stats here. So these are 2017 stats. They're really old. And we see in 2017, every month there's 2 billion people on Facebook. There's 1.5 billion people on YouTube. There's 700 million people on Instagram. And these are old stats. These numbers are so blown up now. The problem is that because the issues of IPOs and all those types of things, no one wants to release their user stats anymore. So this is the latest we have. You realize that even 20 years ago, it was absurd to even think that you could ever have a platform that had that many people connected on it. These are larger than countries. So this changes the way things work. So here's what we see. You can go to the next slide. So this is where we're going to take our break. So you put all these things together, and here's how it all comes together. And this is where we find that we're in crisis, is that the trend here is isolation. Individuating and becoming an adult is already an isolating process, because you very naturally and in a very healthy way are going to isolate yourself from your primary caregivers, your family, and say, I love you guys a lot, or maybe I don't, but either way, I need to figure out who I am away from you, so that we isolate ourselves in that time period. Okay, fine. But then you add to that this layer of a society and a culture that systematically isolates young people just by the structures that exist in the culture. So we just turned isolation up to a 10. And then, because isolation does not feel good, we put a tool in their hands that allows them the illusion of connection, while actually cranking isolation up to a 100. And they're sitting there saying, I feel even worse than I did before. I feel even more isolated than I ever felt before. But I'm connecting, so there's something wrong with me. This is what fuels the crisis we're seeing. So what we're actually seeing is that we see the research right now would tell us that there's a reduction in social risk-taking. In other words, the number of kids that are, taking bong hits at the top of a water tower is way less now than it was in the 70s. We just don't see the same kind of social risk-taking. The amount of young people that are having sex at a young age is actually far less now than it was in the 80s. Number of young people having unprotected sex is far less now than it was in the 90s. So we actually see that social risk-taking is it's coming right down. However, there's an overall increase in significant crisis. Suicide attempts are much more common now. So all the risk-taking that used to occur in groups is down. Why? Well, mostly because no one's really connecting with each other anymore. You don't even have a group to take a risk with. Not a real group. So everything becomes isolated. And so we see increase in suicide attempts. We see increase in self-destructive coping mechanisms. So it's the rise of self-injury and cutting, right? It's the explosion in the prevalence of severe eating disorders in young women and now young men. It's ways that we self-medicate to deal with stuff privately. Exponential increase. Meanwhile, social risk-taking is a decrease. So that's the crisis we're in. And so hence we see really, really scary stuff with young people. We do see widespread trauma. We'll talk about this after the break, but the real side effects when you turn sexuality into a commodity that can be bought, traded, and bartered with are dramatic, especially in a time of your life where you're forming your sense of identity and personhood. So when we turn sex into a commodity, and we'll talk about the rise of the easy access of pornography to young people and what that has done to them, it's created a profound bedrock of trauma. So we now get young people, so I've been a youth worker for 17 years. My assumption when a student walks in our doors is I just assume you are deeply hurt and you don't trust adults and you have secrets that are killing you. That's my just assumption. Like, that's our working starting point. And in 97% of the cases, I'm absolutely right. Because that's what happens. And then we see that, I'm sure some English teacher forced you to read The Lord of the Flies. The Lord of the Flies was a story about McDonald's, I think, but it's about a clown with red hair. But The Lord of the Flies was a horrifying book about a bunch of kids who wind up on an island with no adult supervision and basically resort to the most barbaric forms of government. I mean, it's just crazy. If you're familiar at all with the Stanford prison experiments of the 70s and 60s maybe actually, you kind of see this. So what we see is this sort of Lord of the Flies in the underworld. So imagine you've got this underworld where the only rule is no adults allowed. Just don't let adults in. They can't be trusted. You're being bullied so bad you want to kill yourself? Cool, talk to your friends, but for God's sake, don't talk to an adult. Because they're the only people that aren't on the island. So we see this kind of Lord of the Flies. We see this excessive bullying. We see decisions that adults look at and they say that's so irrational. But here's a way of thinking about it. Nobody ever does something that doesn't make sense to them at the time. So you have to ask yourself, if you're cutting yourself and complying with a bully that says if you don't send them nudes online, they're going to do this and this and this, and you're giving into extortion and then cutting and not telling anyone about it, you sit there, and I've heard parents say, how could you be so stupid? And I just cringe inside. I'm like, nobody ever makes a decision that does not make sense to them at the time. You have to figure out, what on earth world do you live in where that actually made sense? Welcome to where they live. That makes sense where they live. And then on top of that, you get this extended adolescence where the markers for entering adulthood are now delayed by up to 20 years from what they were 50 years ago. That's the crisis. This is why we've got a lot of kids who are having a really hard time, and they could never articulate this. I mean, this is I'm water skiing over these things, but I mean, this is a lot of research and a lot of trends, interdisciplinary, a lot of things we're kind of just plain saying, well, this is kind of the picture. I could spend a week on each of these, but this is why we wind up in crisis. So now we need to explore to say, okay, so now that we at least have the understanding, now we can look at what we see on the surface. So why don't we take a 10-minute break? Let's grab some coffee, use the restroom, all that kind of stuff, and then we'll come back and I'll make you even more depressed. And then tomorrow, we'll actually just tell you how you can fix everything and make it perfect. Okay, is that good? All right, that's it. Let's take a 10-minute break and we'll do that.